Hello and welcome to the second episode number 2 of Blue Collar Breakdown. I'm Tom Edel. I'm the blue collar economist. Today, we're not going to be talking about economics too much, a little bit about tariffs, but mostly I want to talk about Donald Trump. And specifically, I want to talk about how well do you know Trump? How well do you know Trump 47? Now, this episode is not going to be that popular with the people who have Trump derangement syndrome, nor with the Trump cult who thinks he can do no wrong. I want to take an objective look at Donald Trump, and I'm going to start with this. One of the main things about Donald Trump is that he is not a liar; he's a bullshitter, and there's a big difference there. Okay. And I think even Trump fans will agree with me on this one. Okay. He says things to get a reaction, and the truth of what he says is irrelevant to why he says it. Let me give you an example. Okay. During his first term, he had his inauguration, and, he had a good crowd there, but Obama had more. And he was like, the biggest crowds, the biggest ever. There's no doubt. Everybody agrees. There's nobody. Of course, everybody didn't agree. Nobody thought he had the biggest crowds ever. Nobody thought he had the biggest crowds ever. But he stuck with the story because it drove the Democrats crazy. They're like, oh, well, we have all these cameras from the Capitol Police, and you could see here that they've counted this, blah, 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 blah. And those are the people. Those people on the political right were really chuckling over the whole thing. As the story goes, the people who hate Trump take him literally, but not seriously, and the people who love Trump take him seriously, but not literally. And that's sort of the left-right divide. I mean, I don't think there's much to the difference between the left and the right. If you dislike someone who's right wing or far right, it just means that you personally identify as someone who's on the left. And if you really dislike someone on the far left, it means you identify with the right. And you probably have some issues that make you want to identify with the right. Okay. But Trump is a bullshitter. Let me give you one more example. Okay. In his first campaign back in 2016, he said, I'm going to pay off the national debt in 8 years by the end of my second term. And nobody believed that. The national debt was several tens of trillions of dollars. The federal government was only taking in, I think, $3 trillion in taxes every year. There was no way that was ever going to happen. I mean, without unbelievable tax increases and spending cuts. I mean, there was no way. Nobody took that seriously, but he just sticks to that story. All right. That's one thing about Trump. And I think you can't understand Donald Trump if you don't understand that he is this New York bullshitter. Like everything he does, it's the best ever. I'm going to have the very best people. I'm going to have, and in his first term, even by his own admission, he didn't have all the best people. He didn't, he hired John Bolton, who he thought was an idiot. And I agree. He hired a lot of people that he had to fire. And in the second term, he said, "Oh, I'm gonna fix it. I know all the ropes now. I've been president before. Now I know the people who I need to hire and who to fire." Okay, we have about 6 months now of him being president. It's actually just a little over 6 months, right? Because he became president on January 20th. Now it's June 20. What is it? 25th, June 25th. So, okay. So 6 months and 5 days. And we've had quite a 6 months. There's been a lot that's happened, and especially Iran recently, right? And one of the things that I've come to understand is that Trump doesn't have an ideology. He doesn't have fixed beliefs. Other than maybe there's two things. I would say there's two things he absolutely believes in: control the border and do what Israel wants. That's it. Those are the two fixed beliefs in his political system. Everything else is a negotiation, and it's usually an ongoing negotiation. Let me give you some examples from Iran, okay? Iran, now, even in the Iran thing, which deals specifically with Israel, he has arguably flip-flopped on the issue in the last 2 weeks, half a dozen times. All right. He started with negotiating. I'm going to negotiate. He sent, oh man, I can't remember the guy's name, but he sent his negotiator, and he said, okay, Iran's going to be allowed to enrich uranium up to 3.67%, which is enough to use for domestic nuclear energy. And then suddenly they can't. And this was pressure from Israel, but it was a flip-flop, right? And then he says, "Oh, I'm negotiating the process. The progress is good." And of course, he had made fun of Barack Obama for not getting a good deal with Iran. He canceled the Iran deal, and then he made fun of Joe Biden for not being able to get a deal. He made fun of Joe Biden for not being able to negotiate with Yemen and for bombing Yemen. And then he bombed Yemen back in March and April. And he says, I'm negotiating, and then Israel starts attacking Iran. And he's like, oh, America's not doing that. We have nothing to do with it. And then, of course, 2 weeks later, oops. One, all the negotiators are dead. He puts on Truth Social. All the negotiators are dead. In other words, the negotiations were a ruse to lure in and these people and then kill them with Israeli strikes. And then we find out, and he basically says, and I tricked them. Okay. And then he says, okay, now we're bombing. Then the United States goes into it. Now forget about the constitutional issues. The president is required under the Constitution to keep the peace and not engage in acts of war unless there's an absolute emergency where Congress can't be called, and Congress can be called in 24 hours. So he could have waited a day. So now we're bombing, and he says, I planned it with Israel all along. We tricked the Iranians. And then he says, the Iranians, well, come and negotiate again. Well, he's already killed the negotiators. And he said, I've been on Israel's side and I tricked you all along. I mean, why would they do that? Why would they do that? There's absolutely no reason for that. Okay. I'm just going to see if there's any comments here. Okay. And finally, he starts saying, well, we're only doing it for we're only bombing for the nuclear plants. And it was typical Trump bombast, right? It was typical Trump bullshitting. We totally obliterated these sites. They've never been more obliterated than anything that's ever been obliterated in history. Something like that. That's what he always does, right? And maybe they were, but it's Trump. He's going to say that, whether that's true or not, to get the reaction. So you have to understand that about Trump. He's going to say it, whether it's true or not, and you cannot take him seriously that way. And this is, of course, why Iran and Russia have said, well, I don't know why we're going to negotiate if you're going to just trick us and change the deal a few years later or whatever. I mean, this was Putin's big complaint. It's the complaint about a lot of countries with the tariff deal, which I'll get to. Trump has to get about 90 different agreements on tariffs, and he's got one with Britain and kind of a thing with China until August. But the deals are not coming because they don't know where they stand. Trump has changed his mind. He said, we're not doing it for a reason. We're just bombing Iran for the nuclear sites. Then all of a sudden he's talking about a regime change in his Truth Social, saying that gee, it would be nice to have a regime change and make Iran great again. He goes from, well, what we demand is unconditional surrender to, oh, come and negotiate. I mean, it changes day to day. And this is Trump. He's on again, off again, on again, off again. And another example would be Doge. Remember Doge? It's been so long forgotten, right? They were going to get $2 trillion worth of spending cuts. And I believe they could have gotten them too if they had actually looked hard enough and cut a lot of not just the fat. They would have had to cut actual programs, but there's a lot of fat they could have cut for no cost. I mean, foreign aid, that's $50 billion right there. Okay. $50 billion a year that we give in foreign aid. Now, the regular foreign aid bill is like $25 billion, but we always have these supplemental extra things. Israel needs more missiles, whatever it is. And by the way, I think the truce is temporary. I hope it's not. I hope I'm wrong. But Israel was willing to admit it go for the truce, I think, because they were running out of Patriot and Iron Dome and Golden Arrow missiles to shoot down Iran's missiles. And they needed time to restock. I think that's all it was. And Iran has to reassess, so they were willing to do it too. I think that's why we have the truce. They were both like, we're tired, but we'll go back at it later. I think that's probably what's going to happen. And also, I think Iran, which wasn't seeking a nuclear weapon, according to the CIA and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and even the Mossad has historically said they're not seeking a nuclear weapon. And what they did was they changed how do I put it? They changed the narrative from they're not seeking a nuclear weapon to they're very close to a nuclear weapon. Now, Iran has been very close to a nuclear weapon for 30 years, at least since 2003. And they haven't sought one nonetheless. They have enriched beyond what is needed for nuclear energy, but they haven't enriched enough to make a weapon. There's this wide middle ground from 3.67% to 90%, and they've gone right in the middle to try to get the United States and Israel to go back to the negotiating table, and it did not work. So my guess is Iran will probably soon be seeking an actual nuclear weapon. But back to Trump. Doge was supposed to get $2 trillion worth of cuts, and basically Elon Musk found some things. He changed a few contracts where we had contracted with private companies to keep these open warehouses that were empty, and said, well, let's just cancel the contracts. We could save some money. He found, according to him, about $150 billion worth of cuts in spending, which is not nearly enough. That's less than 10% of what they were seeking. But in the end, only 9 point something billion went to Congress, and Congress passed it, and it's still sitting on President Trump's desk unsigned. He's not interested in it suddenly. He's not interested in government spending cuts. Here's another example of flip-flop Trump. Thomas Massie. Thomas Massie is a congressman from Kentucky. He's probably the closest to a libertarian that there is in Congress right now. No, he is the closest there is to a libertarian in Congress right now. I've personally donated to him in the past. Not much, maybe $100 or $50, I forget what, because I thought he was a good congressman. He seemed like a really good guy, very principled. When he voted, he almost always voted with Justin Amash, who was a Republican turned libertarian congressman. And I just think he's a really good guy. Trump has endorsed Massey, but also gone after him. So there's this sort of flip flop there too. Another example is the TikTok ban. He sought the ban on TikTok, but at the same time, he keeps signing waivers. And then last is the tariffs, the Liberation Day tariffs. He talked about, oh, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have these reciprocal tariffs. And that's where I'm going to get into tariffs as I finish up with Trump here. The tariffs went into effect for what, less than a week, and Wall Street freaked out because one, they weren't reciprocal, and two, they would destroy the American economy and consumer goods. I mean, that's the only way to put it. And I'm not someone who is reflexively against tariffs as a substitute for other kinds of taxes. I'll get into that in a minute. But here's Trump, he's pulling back, and now we've got, then he pulled them back, then he added more for China. He flip-flopped. Now we've got this July 8th deadline looming for 90 plus countries where the tariffs are going to go in there. I mean, the window, I think, for Trump is closing, where he's going to be able to pass these reciprocal, air quotes, tariffs all by himself. Constitutionally speaking, only Congress can levy a tax, and a tariff is a tax. So there's no way a president can do that. And Congress can't delegate its own authority away. It's not like, Congress can no more delegate away its authority to tax to Donald Trump than it can delegate away its tax power to Kanye West. It just can't do that. The president doesn't have the power. Only Congress has the power. That's under the Constitution. And I think the courts are eventually going to see that, even if they don't see that with the war power. Because let's face it, the president has usurped the war powers of Congress really since the 50s. I mean, since going back to, I would say, Vietnam under Dwight Eisenhower. Vietnam under Dwight Eisenhower, before Kennedy, we started sending troops. Eisenhower started sending troops to to Southeast Asia without Congress. Just we'll send some advisors. We'll send this. Americans started getting killed, and that's when it began, and it never ended. Congress really has no say over war anymore, and that's just the way it is. I wish it were not so, but that's just the way it is. Anyway, back to tariffs. Or let me finish up Trump, and then I'll go to tariffs here. So I think if you look at Trump, you see, one, he's a bullshitter. He will tell you something to get a reaction. It might be a truth, it might be a lie, but why he says it has nothing to do with whether or not it's truth or a lie. He will double down. If people start freaking out and say, I had the biggest crowds at my inauguration, the biggest ever, everybody agrees, and people say, no, we don't agree, we look at the photos, he's just going to double down. I mean, that's just the way it is. He's like that friend of yours who you catch him in a lie and he just doubles down. It's because the narrative is all that's important. The reaction is all that's important. But not only that, I think, Trump's supporters, they tend to think, okay, I don't care about that. I don't care that Trump personally is kind of a vile person. He's on his third marriage. He's cheating on his third wife. He's just not a good person other than that. But let's face it, he wants, he's got a plan. We got to trust his plan. But when you look at his plans, they're herky-jerky. They're back and forth from day to day, and sometimes even within the same day. If you look at his Truth Social tweets, they are just all over the place. If you look for consistency there, you will not find it, other than the only consistent thing with Trump is inconsistency. And of course, well, I should say, and the border, right? And whatever Israel wants. Those are the only two exceptions. Because even his tariffs, even his much vaunted tariffs, he pulled back. And he should have. Now I'm going to the tariff issue. He should have pulled back from tariffs because, I mean, the United States government has been run on tariffs since the very beginning. The United States government, really from Jefferson's presidency right up through the Civil War, ran on tariffs alone. Now, it was a very small government. The United States imports $3 trillion worth of goods and exports $2 trillion worth of goods. So, and we have a federal budget of about $5.7 trillion. So just keep that in mind. You know, like if we wanted to have the tariff as the only tax, we'd have to tax imports at like 200%. And that's assuming we bring in less imports. You know, just we couldn't do it with the size government that we have. We couldn't do it when we're giving $1 billion to the National Egg Board and the National Honey Board and the Popcorn Board and Israel and all of these crazy programs that we have. We don't need any of those programs, but as long as we have them, we're never going to be able to do what they did in 1820 and just run the entire federal government on a tariff. Now, I'm not reflexively against tariffs from the standpoint of, I'm an economist and I'm supposed to say tariffs bad. You know, I mean, especially an Austrian economist would say, well, this is going to have a very negative impact on international trade and the wealth of the United States. And that is absolutely true. But I think what happens is a lot of economists fail to do the compared to what question, because economics is always about compared to what. A tariff compared to no tariff, no tariff is much better for the economy, for sure. A tariff compared to an income tax, which was the question in 1913 when government was still fairly small. Well, a tariff was better. It was better in most ways. The income tax is more progressive in the sense that the rich, at least at first, only paid income taxes. So, you know, you were able to lighten the burden on the regular working man to a certain extent. But once government got bigger, especially during World War II, everybody started paying income taxes, and it wasn't nearly as progressive. And it still it is still not. The one big benefit with the tariff, though, is privacy for the citizen. When you think about it, Jefferson was able to brag in his second inaugural address, no American ever sees a tax gatherer of the United States unless he's in the business of importing or exporting goods. So as long as you're dealing with goods already in the United States, as long as you're minding your own business, the government, not only, you don't even see a government, they don't have to know your business. Once the income tax came in, then all of a sudden they knew your business. And once they started knowing your business, then they started major manipulations of the market. The income tax is one of the most dislocative taxes in the history of man right now in the United States because of all the deductions and subsidies and there are thousands and thousands of them, and they direct capital in ways that otherwise would not have been. Whereas under the tariff, yes, every tariff has a negative impact on imports. It really kind of directs the consumer to buy domestic goods over foreign goods when that's possible. But the negative impact on the economy is much smaller with a tariff than it is even with an income tax that's levied primarily on the rich. So, and the privacy aspect of, hey, my business is my business and the government has no role in it. That is huge. It is huge for an American who seeks to be free and seeks not to be controlled by government. So in that sense, I as a libertarian, I support the tariff over the income tax. But under our current system, you can't do that. And let's talk a little bit about Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. First of all, they weren't reciprocal. The idea of a reciprocal tariff is, gee, China taxes our goods at an average of 30% or whatever, so we try to tax their goods at an average of 30%. That's reciprocal. But what Trump had done was not that. It was some sort of an algorithm of, well, how many goods do they buy from us versus how many goods do we buy from them? And whatever the differential was, that was the tax rate. So if a country sold a lot more goods to the United States, and one of the highest tariffs was, I believe it was Botswana, which is a huge diamond mining country, and a lot of diamonds come here, and they don't buy American goods because they're poor. So I think they had, I forget, I think it was like a 90% tariff because we were buying all the diamonds from Botswana and they weren't buying any goods from the United States. So even though their taxes on American goods was much lower than 90%, it didn't matter. That was how the Trump tariffs worked. And then plus, because they were across the board tariffs, they were guaranteed to wreck the American domestic economy too. I mean, the protectionist tariffs in the United States from basically the Civil War, from the tariff in 1862. I'm trying to remember the name of the tariff. It was the Morrill tariff. It was I think it was Justin Morrill of Vermont. He was a protectionist Republican, and he had this, we want to raise these taxes for the union, but he really wanted to protect domestic industry. So he raised taxes, and really from 1861 to all the way through the 1930s, the United States had protectionist tariffs, and also in the 1830s. But one of the things that they did was quite a bit smarter than what Trump and Bessent and the people at Treasury have done, which is they realized that we don't want to have a universal, like everything from England is 30% or everything from a particular country is a particular percent. We want to make a distinction between raw materials and finished goods. And we want to make a distinction even between parts and finished goods, because if we tax iron ore coming into the United States, or titanium, or I think titanium is one of the few minerals that we don't have a lot of in the United States. We have to import most of it. Then what's going to happen if iron and titanium and aluminum and all of these imports that are raw materials for automobiles and housing construction, all the rest, all of those costs are going to go up. And the ability for the American auto manufacturer to sell cars abroad, well, they're going to be more expensive because they're going to have to import the raw materials, pay the taxes on it. It's going to be more expensive to make the cars in the United States. Therefore, they have to sell them at a higher price when they sell them abroad, and sell them domestically too. But they're certainly going to be less competitive on the international market, which is the biggest market. I mean, the United States is only, I think it's 17% of the world market, of world GDP. I mean, there was a time when, I think in 1945-6, where the United States was not quite 50% of world GDP, but it was very close. I think it was probably 45%. We made almost half of all of the world's stuff in 1945. Admittedly, we bombed most of the factories that were competing with us in Japan and Germany and Italy, and France was bombed out as well. So those were the main industrial competitors, as well as Britain. But the point here is they made the distinction, but saying, okay, we're not going to tax, or we're going to tax very lowly the raw materials, and maybe mid-range with semi-finished parts, and then the final product, yes, you put a protectionist tariff on it. That's what they did back in the 1830s, and that's what they did in the post Civil War all the way up to through the Great Depression, because they were smart enough to know that if we make all our finished goods much more expensive, we're not going to be able to sell them to the rest of the world. And the line among a lot of Trump supporters is, well, if you don't buy foreign goods, then you don't pay the tariff. But that's not really true. First of all, if you're buying a foreign good, if you get a cup of coffee in the morning, you're buying a foreign good if you're eating a mango, or if you're, I mean, most tropical fruits are imported from abroad. And certainly if you buy them in winter, Florida and California will have oranges in the summer, but if you want grapes in February, you got to get them from Chile. You got to get them from South America. So that's not really true. I mean, you can't really do that. Trump's tariffs were just bad across the board because of they were ill-considered. They were ill-considered. I mean, Trump has supposedly been this great businessman all of his career, and I kind of looked at his, he inherited I think it was $413 million from his father. And by the time he ran for president, he had $3.5 billion net worth. So it was roughly the same if he had gotten all of the $413 billion in 1990. His father died in 1999. And he'd put it in a S&P 500 fund and earned the average there, he would have probably come out about the same. So he's not a financial genius, but he's not terrible either. As far as, I mean, real estate has been one of those markets that have been heavily subsidized by government, and I'm not going to deride him for taking advantage of that. Certainly, Elon Musk has been he has a superpower when it comes to being a tax farmer. He has gotten billions and billions. I think the Washington Post did a story a couple of months back where he had gotten over $36 billion in federal and state subsidies for his various companies, not just Tesla, but also SpaceX. And of course, he's got federal contracts with SpaceX that are, I think, about $6 billion a year right now. So it's going up fast. So I don't mind that, but I guess what I'm saying is he's not a Steve Jobs kind of innovator. He is business wise, he's been able to make money, but he doesn't understand the basics of these tariffs that he's been really talking about since the 1980s. I've seen testimony he gave back, I want to say 1984, might have been a little later in the 80s, might have been 86 or 87. He gave testimony to Congress, and he was talking about how Japan was, I mean, you could have taken one of his speeches about how China was ripping us off today and just taken the word China out and put the word Japan in back for the 80s. And it would have been his speech back then, because Japan back then was, in the 80s, they were the country that was going to take over the world. They were going to surpass the United States economically. And it was this juggernaut economy. Of course, since then, they've done nothing but flounder. I mean, the 90s were terrible for Japan, and they have had lost decades really since then. The average Japanese, I think the Japanese per capita GDP it's not half that of the United States, but I think it's probably there. If you take the average per capita Japanese GDP and make it half again, then it's probably about the United States. I mean, Japan is far behind the United States in wealth, and I mean, obviously, we have double the population too, but I'm just saying on a per capita level, the Americans are richer than Japan. But Trump, even back in the 80s, he was talking about, oh well, we need tariffs and whatever. So he has talked about it, but he has flip flopped on this, just as he's flip flopped on almost every other issue, and he doesn't have a very good understanding of the issue. Anyway, and where are we at? With time wise? Oh, I went my 30 minutes. I don't want to go too much more than 30 minutes. I do want to do these every Wednesday night at 8:30. And of course, you can comment. I believe I can see the comments on YouTube when they go up, and I can post them here. So please feel free to comment if you're listening live. And right now I'm streaming on X, YouTube, and Facebook. So we'll continue doing that, and I'll expand it to Spotify and Rumble very soon. And that's about it. I will see you next week. Keep the working man in your thoughts, and we'll go from there. Let's see if I can run my my close. Yeah, here we go. Enjoy.
Streams coming fast, be a buy me a coffee.